Hi guys and welcome back to the Bike Cave. Today we're going to discuss about the use of water-based fluids for your HS33 hydraulic rim brakes versus mineral oil, which is the suitable one as specified by Magura. Before we start, I have to make clear that you shouldn't fill any disc brake system with water-based fluids, as the disc brake calipers are getting quite hot while braking and the seals are not designed with water in mind. However, in the world of bike trials, it's quite common to fill your hydraulic brake systems with water or water-based alternatives, and today we're going to dive a bit deeper into this topic. So, if you are an older subscriber to the channel, you may have already seen that I've created a lot of brakes related videos over the past years, as I'm sharing with you my journey to optimize my braking system on my competition trials bike. Last year I released a video with my complete routine of how I maintain my HS33 brakes, and you can find the relevant link in the description below. In this video I discuss with you all the issues that I regularly face while dealing with my brakes, and some of you have noticed that I use the standard Magura mineral oil to bleed the brakes, and commented both on YouTube and on other platforms that I posted this video on that most trial riders use water or water-based fluids to bleed their rim brakes. As I have mentioned many times on my videos before, I was fully aware of that, but I wanted to fully experiment with mineral oil and study the factors that affect their performance before I switched to a different brake fluid. Also, it has to be said that after fine-tuning and perfecting my maintenance procedure, I was very pleased with the results, and I can say that my brakes were quite responsive and I had no issue whatsoever while I was using the Magura Royal Blood mineral oil. However, you already know that I'm intrinsically curious and always motivated to experiment with new things. And so, once I uploaded my complete guide to maintain your HS33 brakes last January, I started experimenting with water-based fluids, and for starters, I chose to use the Trialtech one so as to have a fluid with a standard composition to experiment with. At that point, I have to say that you may see me in the future experimenting with different water-based fluids, such as plain water, antifreeze and some other ideas I have in my mind, but this may take a while until I'm able to share it with you guys. So last February I switched to the Trialtech fluid for my rear brake, as I wanted to keep my front one as my control and have a mineral blade brake to compare the rear one with. Also, I didn't want to switch both brakes at once, as I was afraid that I may face different issues that I haven't faced before, and I wanted my front brake to be completely functional until I figure out all the maintenance tricks that a water blade system may need. My first impressions after switching to the water-based fluid for my rear brake were that the blade feel and responsiveness was not very different than the one that I could achieve by following my standard maintenance routine, and I was pretty happy with that, as it reassured me that I had probably optimized everything I was doing while I was using mineral oil as my brake fluid of choice. However, I was determined to continue using this water-based brake fluid for my rear brake so as to see how it affects the hydraulic system in the long term. At that point, I should say that Magura clearly specifies that you have to use the Royal Blood mineral oil so as to ensure that your brakes won't leak and will work perfectly. However, we've already discussed that even by using mineral oil, the HS33 slave cylinders leak a bit of oil via their seals every time you engage your brakes. Also, every time the slave cylinders piston retract, they tend to get contaminated with dust that makes the fluid near the slave cylinders a bit more viscous, changing the response over time and calling for more frequent maintenance the more you ride in dust environments. If you want to learn more about the issues I have faced while using the HS33 slave cylinders and how I managed to solve them, you can check out my video on my maintenance routine for my hydraulic rim brakes. But let's get back to the main topic, and we're going to discuss how the aforementioned issues affect the water blade brake system in a while. So I bled my rear brake with a water-based fluid, and I kept it like that until the next time I had to maintain my brakes. In the meantime, I had no issue while riding my bike, and the rear brake was working perfectly. When I decided to maintain my brakes, which means that I was to thoroughly clean the pistons of the slave cylinders, relube the pistons of the levers, and fully bleed the brakes, I noticed that the seals and the pistons of the slave cylinders of my rear brake were a lot cleaner than the ones of my front brake. This was quite unusual, as the environment around the front brake isn't as contaminated as the one that faces the rear one, because the front wheel is usually away from the ground and I tend to engage the front brake less than the rear one. Nevertheless, I rebled the rear brake with a water-based fluid and kept this observation in my mind for the next time I need to maintain the brakes. Fast forward a couple of months after this one, I decided to maintain my brakes again, and I noticed the same thing once again. The slave cylinders of the rear brake were much cleaner than the ones in my front brake. Also, the water-based brake fluid of my rear brake was not as contaminated as the mineral oil of my front one, which had turned black near the slave cylinders. I was quite impressed with that, and my theory is that, as I've already mentioned, the seals of the slave cylinders leak a bit of brake fluid every time you engage your brakes. If the environment around the exposed slave cylinder piston is contaminated with dust and dirt, the dust and dirt particles will stick to the fluid and they will get reintroduced to the hydraulic system of the brakes once the piston retracts into the slave cylinder. So I think that it may be easier for the dust and dirt particles to stick to the mineral oil than to the water-based brake fluid. Also, the mineral oil will never get dry, and so dirt and dust will keep accumulating, forming an oily, muddy substance around the seals and pistons. Actually, this is what I'm trying to dissolve and clean by spraying WD-40 on the pistons and seals of the slave cylinders every time I want to clean them. Moreover, the dust and dirt particles that are introduced to the hydraulic system are the reason that the viscosity of the fluid around the slave cylinder is decreased and the brakes are getting less responsive. This was quite noticeable as the lever feel of the front brake that had been bled with mineral oil had been worsened much more than the lever feel of the rear one that had been bled with the water-based brake fluid. This means that if I were to bleed both brakes with the water-based brake fluid, I may not need to maintain my brakes as often as I do with the mineral oil. So I decided to bleed both my brakes with the Traltech water-based brake fluid and see if these observations are valid or if they are affected by the front or the rear brake setup and the level of contamination that they encountered during their operation. Last week was my time to maintain my brakes again, and I can now tell you that I'm going to stick to the use of water-based brake fluids for the foreseeable future, but I may experiment in the future with different alternatives so as to fine-tune the feel and responsiveness of my brakes. However, I noticed another issue of the use of water-based fluids that I haven't mentioned yet. I noticed that bleeding my brakes with water-based brake fluid that is less viscous than the Magura Royal Blood may have compromised the capabilities of the slave cylinder piston seals, and so I noticed that the available travel of the master cylinder piston reduces over time and you may need to rebleed the brakes just to add a bit more fluid to the system. I first noticed this one when I was bleeding just my rear brake with the water-based brake fluid, and now I see that the same applies to the front brake, but it's not as noticeable as the more I engage the brake, the more fluid seeps out of the seals and evaporates. Nevertheless, this is not a real issue for me as it cannot counteract the fact that the pistons, the seals and the brake fluid are getting much less contaminated by using water-based brake fluids. I'd much rather prefer to bleed the brakes by adding a bit more fluid once in a while than discarding all the contaminated mineral oil and using more oil to wash away the contaminated brake system. Nevertheless, I have to mention that I still use WD-40 to clean and lube the pistons and the seals of the slave cylinders, despite the fact that they are not getting as contaminated as they used to. Actually, this is still my best advice that can make your brakes feel and perform better almost instantly, in case that they are a bit non-responsive and you don't have time to properly maintain them. After all this maintenance tinkering on my Magura HS33 brakes all these years, I think that I have solved most of my problems and issues I have faced up to now, and I'm going to stick with this setup for now. However, the main problem that cannot be solved regarding the Magura HS33 slave cylinders is that they are not repairable, and I may have something in the works in that direction, but this is a topic for the future. However, if you want to learn more about what I'm working on before I release the final videos on this channel, you can follow me on social media where I upload sneak peeks of what I'm working on many months before I actually create a relevant video here. That's it for today guys, and I hope that this channel was quite helpful for you and help you understand a bit more the factors that affect your hydraulic rim brake systems and what you can do to make your brakes perform as smooth and as snappy as possible. Feel free to share this video if you think that it will be helpful for others too, and give this video a thumbs up if you liked it. Thank you so much for subscribing and watching, and until next time, ride your bikes and make sure that your brakes work just perfectly. Bye!